The morning sun hadn't yet burned off the desert chill when Maria Santos pulled her pickup truck onto the dusty shoulder of State Route 87, just north of Phoenix. October 3rd, 1979. It was barely 6:30 a.m., that perfect hour when the Sonoran Desert transforms from hostile furnace to something almost magical. The saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels against the brightening sky. The temperature hovered around 65 degrees. Within hours, it would climb past 95. Maria was heading to her job at the copper mine in Globe, same as she'd done every day for the past 3 years. The commute was long, lonely, but the pay was good. Better than anything she could find in Phoenix. She'd grown used to these early morning drives, watching the desert wake up, seeing the same landmarks pass by in the half-light of dawn. That's why she noticed something was different that morning. About a quarter mile off the highway, near a cluster of Palo Verde trees she'd passed 1,000 times, there was a flash of color, bright blue against the tan and olive landscape. Fabric, maybe. Probably trash, she thought. People were always dumping garbage out here. It made her angry, the disrespect for this beautiful, unforgiving land. But something made her slow down. Something made her look closer. The blue wasn't moving in the morning breeze, like a plastic tarp would. It was too solid, too still. Maria pulled over, grabbed her binoculars from the glove compartment. She kept them for spotting wildlife, roadrunners, hawks, the occasional bighorn sheep. She focused the lenses, adjusted, focused again. Her breath caught. That wasn't trash. It was clothing, a windbreaker, and someone was wearing it. Maria's hands shook as she lowered the binoculars. Could be a hiker, she told herself. Someone who got lost, needed help. The desert was full of trails, popular with hikers from Phoenix looking for adventure. Instagram photos, a taste of wilderness just an hour from the city. Sometimes they got in trouble. Dehydration, heat stroke, twisted ankles. She grabbed her water bottle and started walking toward the blue windbreaker. The desert floor was rough, scattered with rocks and thorny ocotillo. Every few steps, she called out, "Hello? You okay? Need help?" No response, just the sound of her footsteps crunching on the gravelly soil. As she got closer, details emerged. The person was lying face down, partially hidden by a large boulder. One arm was extended, like they'd been reaching for something. The blue windbreaker was torn, covered in dust. Hiking boots, good ones, expensive looking. "Hey," Maria called again, softer now. She already knew. The stillness, the position, the silence. She'd seen death before. Her grandfather, her cousin. This had that same terrible quietness. She was maybe 10 feet away when she stopped. This wasn't right. This wasn't someone who'd collapsed from heat or exhaustion. The position was wrong. The angle of the body. And was that? She squinted. Dark stains on the rocks nearby. Too dark to be anything but dried blood. Maria backed away slowly, carefully, trying not to disturb anything. Her nursing training from years ago kicked in. Don't contaminate the scene. Don't touch anything. Get help. She practically ran back to her truck, fumbled with the CB radio she'd installed last year after her husband insisted. The channel crackled to life. "This is Maria Santos, on Route 87, mile marker 164. I need police. There's a body out here. I think something bad happened." Within 45 minutes, the quiet stretch of desert became a crime scene. Maricopa County Sheriff's vehicles lined the highway. Yellow tape fluttered in the rising wind. Investigators in boots and wide-brimmed hats carefully made their way to the body, photographing everything, measuring distances, collecting evidence. Detective Jim Morrison, yes, like the singer, he'd heard all the jokes, stood at the edge of the scene, notebook already filling with observations. Male victim appeared to be in his 20s, well equipped for hiking. North Face windbreaker, quality boots, professional grade backpack. The cause of death was obvious once they turned the body. 3 gunshot wounds, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. This was an execution, cold, deliberate. Someone had brought this young man out to the desert and murdered him. But who was he? The body had no identification, no wallet, no driver's license, nothing with a name. His pockets had been emptied. Even the labels in his clothing had been cut out. Someone had gone to great lengths to make sure this victim remained anonymous. Morrison studied the scene, trying to read the story written in the disturbed soil and scattered rocks. There were 2 sets of footprints leading from the highway. The victim's distinctive boot pattern, and another set, smoother-soled shoes, maybe dress shoes. They'd walked together for about 200 yards before the shooting. No signs of struggle at first. The victim had come willingly, at least initially. Maybe he'd known his killer. Maybe he'd trusted them. The footprints suggested they'd stopped, talked perhaps. Then the shooting happened fast. The victim had tried to run. There were stumbling footprints leading several yards before he'd collapsed. The killer's footprints led back to the highway alone. Calm, measured steps. No running, no panic. This person had killed before, or was remarkably cold-blooded, or both. By noon, the temperature had climbed to 98 degrees. The forensic team worked in shifts, taking breaks in air-conditioned vehicles, drinking water constantly. The desert was already trying to claim the scene. Wind scattered smaller evidence markers. Lizards skittered through the crime tape. They found shell casings. 9mm common enough to be untraceable without the gun. They found a partial footprint in a patch of softer soil, good enough for a cast. They found something else too. A small piece of paper wedged between 2 rocks, maybe 20 feet from the body. It had writing on it, partially faded. A phone number, with a Phoenix area code. As the sun reached its peak, they carefully loaded the body for transport to the medical examiner. The desert would keep its secrets for now. But Morrison had been doing this for 15 years. Every killer made mistakes. Every victim had a story. It was just a matter of finding the threads and following them. He didn't know, couldn't know, that this case would consume the next 6 months of his life, then go cold for 44 years. He didn't know that the young man in the blue windbreaker would become one of Arizona's most enduring mysteries. He didn't know that somewhere in Phoenix, a killer was watching the evening news, relieved to hear the victim remained unidentified. The desert had swallowed another secret. But deserts, Morrison would learn, don't keep secrets forever. Sometimes they just hold them for a while, preserving them in the dry air and patient stone, waiting for the right moment to give them back. Before we dive deeper into this case, I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. I'm always amazed by how these stories reach people around the world. And if you're into true crime cases that take decades to solve, hit that subscribe button right now. We're about to unravel one of Arizona's most baffling cold cases. The medical examiner's office in downtown Phoenix was a squat, unremarkable building that held remarkable stories. Dr. Ellen Patterson had been chief medical examiner for 3 years in 1979, and she'd seen her share of desert deaths. Hikers who underestimated the heat, drug deals gone wrong, domestic violence that went too far. But the body from Route 87 troubled her in ways she couldn't quite articulate. He was young, between 22 and 28 years old. Caucasian. 5'10", athletic build. Good dental work, suggesting middle-class background or better. No obvious signs of drug use. His hands were soft, uncalloused, not someone who did manual labor. The hiking gear was all high-end, relatively new. The gunshot wounds told a precise story. The 2 chest shots had come first. Close range, maybe 3 or 4 feet. They would have been fatal, but not immediately. He'd have had maybe a minute, possibly 2. The head shot was the coup de grace, delivered as he lay on the ground, contact wound. The killer had stood over him and made sure. But it was what she found during the internal examination that made this case unusual. The victim's stomach contents included an expensive meal, steak, lobster, wine. He'd eaten at a high-end restaurant within 4 hours of his death. In 1979, Phoenix, there weren't that many places serving surf and turf that late at night. She also found something else. A small tattoo on his inner right ankle, partially hidden by his sock line. It was unusual, not military, not a biker tattoo, not the usual rebellious ink she saw. It was artistic, almost delicate. A small constellation, Orion specifically. Patterson documented everything meticulously. Photographs from every angle, detailed measurements. She kept thinking this young man had people somewhere who were missing him. Parents, maybe siblings, friends. Someone had to be looking for him. But days passed, then weeks. No missing person reports matched the victim. Morrison and his team showed the morgue photos, carefully cropped to be less traumatic, to dozens of people. Hotel workers, restaurant staff, hiking shop employees. Nobody recognized him. The phone number from the piece of paper led to a payphone outside a Phoenix convenience store. Useless. The high-end restaurants were canvassed. Several had served surf and turf that night, but none of the staff remembered anyone matching the victim's description. It was as if he'd materialized in the desert, just to die there. Morrison developed a theory. The victim wasn't local. He was from out of state, maybe in Phoenix for business or pleasure. The killer knew this, counted on it. Chose someone whose absence wouldn't be immediately noticed in the area. But that raised more questions. How did killer and victim meet? What was the motive? The detective spent hours at the crime scene, returning again and again as the investigation stalled. He walked the path from the highway to where the body was found. He stood where the killer had stood. He tried to understand. The location was deliberate. This stretch of highway was busy enough during the day, but nearly deserted at night. The spot where the body was found couldn't be seen from the road unless you were really looking. But it wasn't so far that carrying a body would be necessary. The killer had made the victim walk to his own execution. Why here? Morrison studied maps, looked for patterns. This wasn't a usual dumping ground. They didn't find other bodies, other crimes in the immediate area. This spot meant something to the killer. Or maybe it was random, chosen for its convenience. Every possibility led to more questions. Meanwhile, the press had picked up the story. Desert mystery, unknown, hiker found shot. The articles were short, buried in the back sections. Without a name, without a face the public could relate to. The story lacked the hook that kept people interested. John Doe murders rarely captured attention for long. Patterson performed one more test, something new that the department had just started using. She took detailed photographs of the victim's teeth and sent them to forensic odontologists around the country. Dental work, especially expensive dental work, left records. Maybe somewhere a dentist would recognize their own handiwork. But autumn turned to winter, such as it was in Phoenix, and nothing came back. The case grew cold with the desert nights. Morrison had other cases, new murders that demanded attention. The file on the Route 87 John Does grew thicker, but no clearer. By January 1980, the body had been held for 3 months. With no identification and no leads, the county made the decision to bury him. A pauper's funeral in a numbered grave. Plot 478, Row 12, Phoenix Municipal Cemetery. The only mourner was Morrison himself, who stood in the winter sun and made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "I'll find out who you are," he said to the fresh-turned earth. "I'll find out who did this." He didn't know it would take 44 years to keep that promise. The victim buried in Plot 478 had a name, though no one in Arizona knew it. David Michael Chen, 24 years old, from San Francisco. He'd been reported missing, just not in Phoenix. His family had filed the report in California. When he didn't return from what he'd said was a weekend hiking trip. David was the kind of person who made friends easily. Born to a Chinese immigrant father and Irish-American mother, he'd grown up straddling two cultures in San Francisco's Richmond district. Brilliant but restless, he'd graduated from Berkeley with a degree in computer science in 1977, just as the tech industry was beginning its transformation. He worked for a small startup in Palo Alto, one of those companies with more ambition than funding, trying to ride the wave of the personal computer revolution. David was their star programmer, the one who could see solutions where others saw problems. He worked long hours, but always made time for his real passion, hiking. The Orion tattoo had been his college rebellion, gotten after a camping trip to Yosemite, where he'd spent a night laying on granite, watching the constellation wheel overhead. His mother had been horrified. His father had just shaken his head. But David loved it, loved the connection to something bigger than code and circuits. That September, David had told his roommate he was taking a long weekend to check out some trails in Arizona. He'd been talking about the Sonoran Desert for months, showing anyone who'd listen photos from Arizona Highways magazine. The saguaros fascinated him. The idea of hiking in a landscape that looked like another planet appealed to his sense of adventure. "You sure about going alone?" his roommate Kevin had asked. "I might meet up with someone down there," David had replied, vague in that way he sometimes was. "This guy I've been talking to about trails." Kevin hadn't pressed. David was private about some things, especially his dating life. In 1979, San Francisco, being a young gay man, meant navigating carefully, even in a city more accepting than most. David wasn't closeted exactly, but he wasn't open either. He lived in that gray space many did, out to some, careful around others. The person David was meeting in Phoenix was someone he'd connected with through a hiking enthusiast newsletter, one of those photocopied zines that circulated among outdoors types. They'd exchanged letters for months. Talk about trails and equipment had evolved into something more personal. The man he'd signed his letters Tom W. had suggested they meet in person, tackle some Arizona trails together. David had been excited but nervous. Meeting someone from letters was always risky. But Tom seemed genuine. He knew the desert, had recommended specific trails, had even offered to pick David up from the airport. They'd agreed to meet for dinner first, get to know each other before heading out to the trails. On September 30th, David had flown to Phoenix on Western Airlines. Flight 451. He'd packed his best hiking gear, that blue North Face windbreaker he'd saved up for, his new boots. He'd made a reservation at a motel near the airport for 3 nights. He'd told Kevin he'd be back Tuesday for a work presentation. He never made it back. When David didn't show up for work, his colleagues assumed he'd extended his trip. David was valuable enough that minor infractions were overlooked. But when he missed the presentation, people got worried. Kevin called David's parents. They called the motel in Phoenix. David had checked in, but never checked out. His room was undisturbed, his luggage still there. The San Francisco police took the report, but didn't prioritize it. Adult men went missing all the time, especially young men who might be exploring their sexuality. They'd often turn up after a few days or weeks, embarrassed but unharmed. David's parents pushed, called daily, but without evidence of foul play, there wasn't much the police would do. They never connected their missing son to an unidentified body found 400 miles away in the Arizona desert. Why would they? David was supposed to be hiking, yes, but in established trail areas, not off a remote highway. The Phoenix authorities never thought to check missing persons reports from other states, not for what seemed like a local murder. David's parents hired a private investigator in November 1979. He traced David's movements to Phoenix, confirmed the flight, the motel check-in, even found a restaurant receipt from that last night. Chez Laurent, an upscale French place in Scottsdale. The receipt was for 2 dinners, expensive wine, paid in cash. But the trail went cold there. The investigator couldn't find Tom W. from the letters. David's parents hadn't even known about the correspondence until they'd gone through his apartment. The letters were vague, no return address, just a Phoenix postmark. Without more to go on, even the private investigator had to admit defeat. By 1981, David's parents had him declared legally dead. They held a memorial service at a small chapel in San Francisco, a heartbreaking gathering of family and friends, mourning someone whose fate remained unknown. His mother kept his room exactly as he'd left it for years, hoping he might somehow walk through the door. They never stopped wondering, never stopped hoping for answers. David's father died in 1998. His mother in 2003, both going to their graves, not knowing their son was buried in an unmarked plot in Phoenix, listed in official records only as John Doe, bar 79-584. The letters David had received from Tom W. were eventually thrown away when his apartment was cleaned out. Evidence that might have solved the case decades earlier ended up in a San Francisco landfill. The only person who knew what happened that night in the desert was the killer himself. And he had every reason to stay quiet. Quick question. What time is it where you're watching this? Are you one of those 3 a.m. true crime bingers like me? Drop the time in the comments. There's something about these stories that just hits different late at night, isn't there? The years rolled by like tumbleweeds across the desert. 1980 became 1985. The Cold War ended. The internet was born. Phoenix exploded from a mid-sized city to a sprawling metropolis. The highway where Maria Santos found the body became a major thoroughfare, widened and paved, thousands of cars passing daily over the spot where a young man had died. Detective Jim Morrison retired in 1994 after 30 years on the force. The unsolved cases haunted him, but none more than the Route 87 John Doe. He'd kept a copy of the file at home, against regulations. Sometimes he'd spread out the photos, the evidence reports, trying to see something he'd missed: the partial footprint, the shell casings, the Orion tattoo, the expensive meal, pieces of a puzzle that wouldn't fit together. Dr. Patterson retired in 1997. She, too, remembered the young man with the constellation tattoo. In her farewell speech, she mentioned the cases that stayed with you, the ones without resolution. She didn't name him specifically, but she was thinking of him. New detectives inherited the cold case. Some gave it fresh eyes, ran the evidence through new databases as they became available. In 2001, they entered the DNA profile into CODIS, the newly established national DNA database. No matches. In 2005, they uploaded dental records to a missing persons database. Nothing. The case file moved from active to cold, from cold to archived. Boxes of evidence in a warehouse, gathering dust with hundreds of other unsolved murders. The desert had kept it secret. But technology has a way of resurrecting the dead, at least in terms of identity. In 2019, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office received a grant to pursue cold cases using investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that had caught the Golden State Killer, that was revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country. Detective Lisa Chen, no relation to David, just one of those cosmic coincidences, was assigned to review cases that might benefit from the new technology. She was young, ambitious, had grown up watching CSI and dreaming of solving the unsolvable. The Route 87 John Doe file caught her attention. Good DNA sample preserved, clear victim profile, the kind of case that genetic genealogy was made for. She submitted the evidence for analysis in January 2020, just before the world shut down. The pandemic delayed everything. Labs closed, reopened, struggled with backlogs. But slowly, the work continued. DNA extracted, sequenced, uploaded to genealogy databases. Family trees built, connections mapped. In March 2021, she got a call. "We have a potential match." The genetic genealogists had found relatives, distant cousins who'd uploaded their DNA to ancestry sites. The family tree led back to a couple in San Francisco, immigrants who'd married in the 1950s. They'd had 3 children. One son, David Michael Chen, born 1955. Lisa's hands shook as she searched for David Michael Chen. There he was, reported missing October 1979 in San Francisco. The dates lined up, the age matched. The physical description was right. She called the San Francisco Police Department. Did they still have the missing persons file? They did, digitized and archived. They emailed it over. Photos of David, smiling, young, alive. The same face she'd been staring at in morgue photos. There was more. David's sister was still alive, living in Seattle. Lisa made the call herself. How do you tell someone you've found their brother after 42 years? How do you explain he's been in an unmarked grave all this time? "We've identified your brother," Lisa said, after gentle preliminaries. "David, we found him." The silence on the other end lasted so long, Lisa thought the call had dropped. "Where?" Finally a whisper. "Phoenix. I'm sorry to tell you he was murdered. In 1979. We've had his case all this time. We just didn't know who he was." The sister Nancy, now 68 years old, had spent her entire adult life wondering. She'd suspected David was dead. After so many years, what else could you think? But finally knowing, broke something loose in her. Grief, relief, anger, all of it at once. Nancy flew to Phoenix 2 weeks later. She stood in the cemetery where David had been buried, Plot 478, now with a headstone bearing his name. She brought photos to show Lisa. David at graduation, David on hiking trips, David laughing at some long-forgotten joke. He was brilliant, Nancy said. Kind, funny. He had his whole life ahead of him. She also brought something else. Letters she'd found in her parents' belongings after they'd died. Letters from David, sent from Phoenix just before he disappeared. He'd been excited about meeting someone, about exploring the desert. The last letter, postmarked the day before his death, mentioned dinner plans. But identifying David was only half the equation. They still needed to find his killer. And after 44 years, that seemed impossible. Whoever Tom W.'s was, he'd likely died or disappeared. Trail that cold doesn't warm up easily. But Lisa Chen was nothing if not persistent. She went back through everything with David's identity as context. The expensive dinner made more sense now. Someone was trying to impress him. The execution-style killing suggested personal connection gone wrong. This wasn't random. David had been targeted. She pulled restaurant records from 1979, what little still existed. Chez Laurent had closed in 1988, but she tracked down former employees. One remembered that night, or thought he did. 2 men, 1 young Asian man, 1 older white man. The older man had paid cash, been particular about the wine. It wasn't much, but it was something. Lisa began building a profile of the killer. Male, likely white, older than David, financially comfortable enough for expensive dinners. Someone who knew the desert well enough to pick that specific dump site. Someone who could convince David to get in a car and drive out to the middle of nowhere at night. Someone who, 44 years later, probably thought he'd gotten away with it. She had no idea that across town, in a retirement community in Scottsdale, an 82-year-old man had been following the news about cold cases being solved through DNA. That he'd been losing sleep, wondering if his long-buried secret was about to surface. That he'd already started making plans, just in case the knock on the door finally came. The knock came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November 2023. Thomas Whitfield, 82 years old, was awake, dressed, sitting in his living room, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He'd been expecting this moment for weeks, maybe years, maybe since that night in 1979. When he opened the door to find detectives with badges and solemn faces, he simply said, "I suppose you're here about David." The arrest shocked everyone who knew him. Thomas Whitfield was a pillar of the Scottsdale retirement community, former chemistry professor at Arizona State University, volunteer at the local library, widower who'd lost his wife to cancer 10 years prior, the neighbor who helped with groceries, who attended every community board meeting, who seemed like everyone's kindly grandfather. But Detective Lisa Chen had done her homework. Whitfield had been 38 in 1979, teaching at ASU. He'd been married then, with 2 young children, the perfect family man. Except he'd been living a double life, meeting young men in secret, terrified of being discovered in an era when being gay could cost you everything. The breakthrough hadn't come from DNA. It had come from old-fashioned detective work. Once they knew David's identity, Lisa had painstakingly traced his connections. She'd found the hiking newsletter where David had advertised looking for trail companions in Arizona. She'd tracked down other subscribers from that era. One remembered Tom from Phoenix, who frequently wrote about desert trails. Tom, who taught at the university. Tom, who suddenly stopped contributing to the newsletter in late 1979. From there, it was patience and process. Finding all the Toms who taught at ASU in 1979, eliminating them one by one. Thomas Whitfield had tried to erase his tracks, but not everything can be erased. Employment records. A driver's license photo from 1979 that looked remarkably like the composite sketch a restaurant worker had helped create. And then there was the shoes. Whitfield had been meticulous, but he'd made one mistake. He'd kept them. Italian leather dress shoes in his closet, worn but preserved, the sole pattern matching the partial print from the crime scene. After 44 years, he'd kept the shoes he'd worn the night he killed David Chen. When Lisa asked him why he'd kept them, Whitfield had looked confused. They were expensive shoes, he'd said, as if that explained everything. The story came out in pieces during interrogation. Whitfield had connected with David through the newsletter, had initiated the correspondence. He'd been attracted to David, had built up a fantasy about their meeting. When David had responded to his invitation to visit Phoenix, Whitfield had been elated. But the dinner at Chez Laurent had gone wrong. David had been kind, but clear. He was interested in friendship, in hiking, but nothing romantic. He'd mentioned a boyfriend back in San Francisco, someone Whitfield hadn't known about. "I'd risked everything," Whitfield said, his voice flat, emotionless, even after all these years. "My job, my family, my reputation." And he sat there, eating the dinner I'd paid for, telling me he wasn't interested. They'd left the restaurant. Whitfield had suggested driving out to see the desert at night, promised David a spectacular view of stars. David, trusting, had agreed. Whitfield had brought the gun, though he claimed he hadn't planned to use it. But in the desert, when David had talked about heading back, about catching his flight home the next day, something had snapped. "I couldn't let him leave," Whitfield said. "He knew who I was. What if he told someone? What if word got back to the university? My wife?" So he'd shot David Chen 3 times and left him in the desert. He'd driven back to Phoenix, gone home to his sleeping wife and children, and pretended nothing had happened. He'd destroyed the letters, avoided the hiking newsletter, never went back to that stretch of highway. For 44 years, he'd lived with it, raised his children, advanced his career, retired with honors, attended his wife's funeral, became a beloved community member. All while David Chen lay in an unmarked grave. The arrest made national news. Beloved professor arrested in 44-year-old cold case. The retirement community was in shock. His children, now in their 50s, released a statement expressing disbelief and heartbreak. Former students couldn't reconcile the mentor they'd known with the killer he'd confessed to being. Nancy Chen flew back to Phoenix for the arraignment. She sat in the courtroom, staring at the back of Whitfield's head. This ordinary-looking old man had stolen 44 years of her brother's life, had robbed her parents of the chance to see their son again, had let them die not knowing what had happened to David. When asked if he had anything to say, Whitfield turned slightly toward Nancy. "I'm sorry," he said. "It shouldn't have happened. David was a good person. He didn't deserve it." Nancy's response cut through the courtroom's silence. "You're right. He didn't. Let me ask you something. Do you think justice can really be served after 44 years? Can an 82-year-old man going to prison balance the scales for a life cut short at 24? Drop your thoughts in the comments. These are the questions that keep me up at night. Also, tell me what the weather's like where you are. It's strange to think people all over the world, in different seasons and climates, are learning David's story right now. The trial of Thomas Whitfield began in March 2024. The prosecution, led by a young district attorney who wasn't even born when David Chen was murdered, faced an unusual challenge. How do you prosecute a crime from 1979 when many witnesses are dead, evidence has degraded, and the defendant is an elderly man with health issues? But they had Whitfield's confession. They had the shoes. They had the forensic evidence, carefully preserved for decades. They had Nancy Chen, who testified about her brother's life, his dreams, the hole his absence had carved in their family. The defense tried to argue diminished capacity, that Whitfield's age and health should be considered. They painted a picture of a man tormented by his sexuality in an era when being gay meant risking everything. They called it a crime of passion, a momentary break in an otherwise lawful life. The prosecution countered with the calculated nature of the crime. The gun brought to the meeting, the careful selection of the dump site, the decades of silence while a family suffered. This wasn't a moment of madness. It was murder, planned and executed. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty of murder in the first degree. At sentencing, the judge addressed something that had been largely unspoken during the trial. Mr. Whitfield, you killed David Chen, not just because he rejected your advances, but because he represented something you couldn't accept in yourself. You murdered him because he was living openly what you could only live in shadow. That fear, that self-hatred, it cost a young man his life and a family their loved one. Whitfield was sentenced to 25 years to life. Given his age, it was effectively a life sentence. He'd die in prison, something David's sister Nancy found grimly appropriate. He had 44 years of freedom David never got, she said outside the courthouse. I don't feel sorry for him. The case's resolution rippled outward in unexpected ways. Other cold cases from the same era were reopened, re-examined with new technology and fresh eyes. 3 more murders were solved within a year, including another young man found in the desert in 1981. ASU conducted an internal review, acknowledging the tragedy and establishing a scholarship in David Chen's name for LGBTQ students in computer science. It felt hollow to Nancy, but she appreciated the gesture, the acknowledgement that her brother's death meant something. The retirement community where Whitfield had lived struggled with the revelation. How do you process that someone you knew, someone you trusted, was capable of murder? Support groups formed. Difficult conversations were had about assumptions, about the faces people show the world versus who they really are. For the LGBTQ community in Phoenix, the case brought up painful history. The fear that men like Whitfield had lived with that had driven him to violence. The progress made since 1979, when being openly gay could cost you everything. The reality that David Chen had died simply for being who he was, for living authentically, in a way his killer couldn't. A memorial was placed at the spot where David's body was found, though the exact location had been lost to highway expansion. It reads, David Michael Chen, 1955-1979. Hiker, dreamer, brother, The desert remembers. Every October 3rd, the anniversary of the discovery, hikers leave stones at the memorial, a Jewish tradition Nancy had requested. The pile grows each year, people adding to it who never knew David, but feel connected to his story. Young gay men who can't imagine the fear of 1979. Families of other cold case victims still waiting for answers. Sometimes Nancy herself, flying in from Seattle to add her stone, to tell David about the years he missed. Detective Lisa Chen, who'd cracked the case, received commendations and job offers from departments across the country. She stayed in Phoenix, committed to the cold case unit. There were more victims waiting for their names back, more families waiting for answers. She kept a photo of David Chen on her desk. Not the morgue photo, but one Nancy had shared. David on a mountainous trail, smiling, arms spread wide like he was embracing the whole world. A reminder of why the work mattered, why even 44-year-old cases deserve to be solved. In his cell, Thomas Whitfield rarely spoke. He read, he ate, he slept. He wrote letters to his children that went unanswered. He'd been given a life sentence at 82, but the real sentence was living with what he'd done, no longer able to hide behind the fiction of the life he'd built. Sometimes he thought about David Chen, the young man who'd been kind, even while rejecting him, who'd talked excitedly about computers and hiking and the boyfriend in San Francisco, who'd trusted him enough to get in his car that night. He'd destroyed so much in those few seconds in the desert. David's life, the Chen family's wholeness, his own family's innocence, his carefully constructed identity. All for what? Fear of exposure? Wounded pride? He didn't even know anymore. The desert remembers everything. It preserves what the rain would wash away, what time would erode elsewhere. Footprints last for years in the right conditions. Evidence waits patiently to be found. And sometimes, after decades of silence, it gives up its secrets. David Chen is no longer John Doe, or 79, 584. He has his name, back, his story, his place in the world. His murder is no longer unsolved, no longer a mystery haunting the desert highways. Justice, delayed but not denied, has been served. But this case reminds us of larger truths. How many John and Jane does remain unidentified? How many families are still waiting? How many killers believe they've escaped justice? The technology that solved David's case exists now. The will to pursue old cases is growing. The desert, and time itself, may be running out of places to hide secrets. For Nancy Chen, now 70, the resolution brings complicated peace. Her brother is still gone. The years still stolen. But she knows what happened. She knows why. She's seen his killer held accountable. It's not enough. Nothing could be. But it's something. She still hikes, though her knees complain more than they used to. Sometimes she thinks about David on the trails, imagines the conversations they might have had, the hikes they could have taken together. She carries some of his ashes with her always, in a small vial on a chain. She's left bits of him on mountains across the West, returning him to the places he loved. The last time she visited Phoenix, she drove out to the desert at sunset. Not to the memorial, but to a trail David had mentioned in his last letter home. She hiked until she could see the city lights beginning to twinkle, the desert cooling around her, the stars emerging. Orion rose in the east, the constellation David had loved enough to mark on his skin. Nancy touched the vial at her neck and spoke to the desert air. "You're found now," she said. "You're home. You're remembered." The desert wind carried her words away, out across the ancient landscape that holds so many secrets, so many stories, but one fewer than before. One soul reclaimed from the anonymity of violence. One name returned to the role of the living and the grieved. David Michael Chen, 1955-1979. Son, brother, dreamer. Found. If this story moved you, and I genuinely hope it did, please share it. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. These stories matter. These victims deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve answers. And every share helps spread awareness about cold cases that might still be solved. Drop a comment telling me what you think about investigative genetic genealogy. Is it a miracle of modern science, or does it raise privacy concerns? What case should I cover next? Remember, somewhere out there, families are still waiting for answers. Technology is advancing. Investigators are working. And sometimes, even after 44 years, justice finds a way. Until next time, I'm going to keep diving deep into cases that need to be told. Stories that remind us that every victim has a name. Every family deserves closure. And time doesn't erase the need for truth. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for helping keep these stories alive. David Chen's case is closed, but the work continues. The desert remembers, and so should we.